Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about playing cards, specifically some tips and tricks I have for learning to use them in Divination or for Cartomancy. I have some books and decks, and I'm going to share how I use these or how I have used them to learn to use playing cards for divination myself. This is a question that I get frequently, semi-frequently, whenever I show a deck of playing cards and speak to my studies and my practice with them, and so I figured I would offer what I do have as far as what seems to be helpful for me. So without further ado, I'll dive in and start with some books, because that's how I usually begin studying anything. Just putting some decks to the side. You may notice the lighting is not the best. Also, it's a very gloomy day, so I've tried to artificially light up the room as best I can, and I've cozied up with a blanket and a coffee, so if you're out there and you feel so inclined, grab a nice beverage for yourself and settle in. But without further ado, a few books that I recommend. The first one that I read, and one that I would still definitely recommend, is the Playing Card Oracles, a source book for divination by Cortez. She is an amazing author, writer. She is a practitioner of cartomancy and using playing cards for readings as well. She's very knowledgeable. She has a very approachable way of starting to learn playing card divination. There's something that is more story-like about the way that she goes about it. I will say that her system specifically is more specific to her deck, which I will show. She has more than one deck, actually. This is the first one, I believe, and then there's an alchemical version of this one. The illustrations, these are the backs. The illustrations are by her father, and that's who she primarily learned playing card divination from, as she writes it in her book. So this is what the cards look like. So they are a little bit more heavy on the imagery, which can be helpful for somebody who's just coming into learning playing cards. You aren't just looking at, for example, 6 spades or 5 hearts. You do get to see something that's supposed to fit with the idea of the meaning. A big thing with playing cards that I found is that it's not as standardized as some systems like tarot, although there are subsets of tarot, and of course we all have our own way of practicing and interpreting. I would say with playing cards, it really is more of a free-for-all, and every book you read will have something wildly different to say about the same cards in many cases. So for Anna specifically, the system does adhere to, or her book adheres to her system, but I will say she factors in a lot of different correspondences. There's a way of approaching this that is very, I would say, not simple and easy, but it doesn't feel complicated. It doesn't feel intimidating, which is why I enjoy it. There are a lot of correspondences that you can draw from. She brings in geomancy. She brings in tips for how you might actually go about laying out the cards and drawing them and interpreting them, alongside, for example, actual meanings of each of the cards, going into, for example, the imagery and how that may apply to it. So I find that that is good for memory retention and getting a baseline understanding of what something might mean before maybe developing your own system of meanings or way of interpreting the cards. I will say that in many playing cards systems, I guess, there are elemental correspondences generally ascribed to each of the suits. For example, we have diamonds, we have clubs, spades, and hearts. That worked out pretty well. And usually there's an element assigned to them. In Anna's system, the diamonds are actually attributed to fire, which is less common I've seen in other books and in other systems. So that might be something that throws you off later on as far as trying to get some sense of continuity in your learning with playing cards. Nonetheless, I enjoy this imagery. I think the deck is great. I think Anna's specific system and history with the cards is extremely helpful and valuable. She also has another book that is a little bit more of a memoir, but does bring in playing card divination, something with alchemy in the title. But this would be the one I would pick up to actually learn the cards. I do think you would probably benefit from having her deck to read alongside this book instead of just a normal deck of playing cards. Otherwise, a lot of what is said in here might be lost on you. So these two are a matching set or pair, and I'd recommend to interact with them and learn with them in that way. And this is where I started actually with this deck and with this book before delving into anything else, which is why I think it's a great starting point as far as imagery goes, because it can be a little bit more difficult to jump into something with no imagery involved. I think that also, you may lose interest if you dive in and there's immediately no imagery and you're trying to place ideas upon very rudimentary images compared to more scenic and illustrated cards. That tends to be the case with tarot as well. In my opinion, many people start with the Rider-Waite-Smith or a deck that's a little bit more illustrated, and Marseille tends to be one that's thought of as being a little bit more difficult to interpret, or one that people then move on to. It's not always the case, but I do think that if you're trying to learn and keep your interest and remain engaged, that's a good place to start. Now, other books that I recommend, I think the one that I may recommend the most and the one that is the most efficient as far as just getting you that information and really packing a lot into a little is this book here. This is Playing Card Divination, Every Card Tells a Story by Stephen Ball. As you can see, it's a rather small book, not too long. The reason I really enjoy this one specifically is because, one, you can use any type or deck of playing cards with this one because there's no imagery that needs to be assigned to anything. So you can pick up the one that you have in your house that you use for games. But each card gets a story, a very short sort of fiction story. It's fun to read this book because you are reading essentially a series of short stories. So if you like fiction, if you like fantasy, if you like all of those sorts of elements, this is going to be really helpful and fun. You may not even realize that you're learning playing card divination when you're reading these. He also has a very specific system of his own, as many authors seem to. They have systems of their own, but there's a combination of the number in any given suit, so 1 through 10 in diamonds, clubs, spades, and hearts. And all of those will speak to a step in a journey, very much like the Fool's Journey or the progression in a sort of cycle to completion or mastery. We see that in this. So all of the 2s are going to have a sort of similarity between all of them, same with the 3s. And then, of course, the suits themselves apply to a specific area of life. So we have things like the 2 of diamonds, which would be considered the lover's gambit, because I think hearts are lovers and 2s are always the gambit. And so there's even a chart in the beginning that goes through the court cards, for example. You have them outlined in a way where we get the Jack of Clubs, which is the trickster's promise. The story associated is Sabrina betrayed, keywords, lies, betrayal, worthless assurances. But you read the stories are only, I would say, like 2 or 3 pages, but they pack a lot in, and it gives you a more circumstantial way of viewing how that card might apply to something that's in the real world. So that way you aren't left with a very raw definition that you don't know how to apply to life. You're constantly getting examples of how these scenarios might play out in real life and look like in a story. So this one was an enjoyable read overall. I would have read this even if I did not want to learn anything about playing cards, just for the short stories. And of course, it packs a lot in a little, and I think the system is very easy to kind of latch on to given the storytelling element. So highly, highly recommend this one for sure. And then another one that I found to be helpful for a completely different reason is Fortune Telling Using Playing Cards by Jonathan D. Another smaller one. I found that a lot of playing card divination books have this more small, square-like look to them for some reason. I've read a bunch that are like that. Of course, this does go through basic meanings, as many of these books do, so that's really helpful. But the thing that I gained the most from this was history of playing cards. So whether that is more of the Romani tradition, or a more Americanized folk type of way of going about it, or a Southern European way of approaching it, or French, this book covers all of those. And so you'll get a taste of knowing how different cultures and different aspects and people throughout history have taken the playing card system and used it. And so you know why certain meanings are what they are. And of course, then you can decide if you like one of these best and kind of veer in that direction. There's also a bit on Lenormand in here, which many will know is connected to playing cards. The Lenormand deck is a smaller set of cards that usually does have images, but they do correspond to a playing card in a larger full playing card deck. So you'll learn a bit on Lenormand in this book and the history of that, as well as the entirety of a playing card deck, along with the meanings. And then there are some suggestions and fun exercises at the back as far as readings you can do, how you would go about pulling the cards. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I used this book and an exercise in it where one interacts with and like pays, I'll link it around, where the idea of paying to read your potential fortunes and sacrificing something of your own in order to gain something from the cards, that's a big, more folky way of interpreting. So I did show an example of that, I believe, at one point, and I'm pretty sure it was from this book. There are all sorts of things like that, ways of going about using the cards and how they have been used, historically speaking, things that transcend, I would say, just a normal spread on the table. But there are things like grand tableaus and ways of reading the cards in relation to each other, so that way you can create a story or understand what you're looking at on a table when you are interpreting cards. So for that reason, I would highly recommend this. These two together, I feel like, would be a really great starter set. The only reason I'm not saying that the Anna Cortez book is great is just because it really does apply to her deck. So I do think it's worth it. I do think it's beginner friendly. And if you like what her deck looks or appears to be, definitely go for that. If you are just picking up a plain playing card deck, I would say that you can't go wrong with these two. Reading them in conjunction with one another will give you a solid foundation. Those for me are 3 books that I would highly recommend to beginners to start with. I've read a couple other books, a bunch of other books, and some of them felt to be a bit repetitive, or they dragged on, or they weren't beginner friendly. So it's not that any of those books are bad, but for anybody just looking to delve into this and who really wants to get to the portion of their practice where they're actively reading and learning through experience, I think these are going to get you there very quickly and get you started on a good foot. Now, I showed Anna Cortez's deck and mentioned that that was basically my first playing card deck that I used for divination. I find the imagery, for example, is very helpful for a beginner. I will also say that if anybody out there, and there's a good chance if you're watching this and watch my channel that you do already read tarot to some extent, but if you are familiar with tarot and that system, I think it will help you a lot. A big tip for me that I had to kind of give myself that I use for my tarot students, because I do teach tarot classes, but a tip that I use in tarot is for the minors, when in doubt, to take the number and the element, and those can then turn into something. So it's a little bit more of this mathematic approach of 1 + 1 = 2. So the idea of the number 3 or numerology combined with the idea of an element, which would have to do with, for example, the suit that you're looking at. So we have, it's not the best example because it's a court card. Let's see. I'm like pulling out every court card right here. All right, so we have the 9 of hearts. So you would take the number 9, and if you have any sort of history or background in numerology, whether that comes from tarot or the Kabbalah or other practices that you engage in, take that type of numerology. You might have some understanding of what the element is. For example, with hearts, it might be water. And of course, if you're reading tarot, the cups. So you can then take that tarot knowledge and transpose it onto the cards as you're beginning to learn and function with this new system. I know that in many cases we want to learn the system as it is, and it can kind of feel like cheating if we then take something we already know and are kind of interpreting this card, for example, the same way we might the 9 of cups. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing or cheating. I think eventually over time you will come to interpret it in its own light and in its own way. And even if it does have this sort of flair or undertone of tarot interpretation, I think that that just goes to show what any of us are in terms of our practice. And we don't necessarily need to put a hard and fast line between playing cards and other systems of card reading. I would definitely use those to your advantage, to your strength, and I think that you will be able to find yourself reading with the cards actively a lot more quickly if you allow your previous experience in other facets of spirituality, card reading, divination to influence what's going on in the cards. So tarot readers, that's a good tip. To take your tarot knowledge and use it, and don't feel ashamed of it, and don't try to detach the card reading from that, at least not at first. And then if you are more new to card reading overall, I would say investing in numerology as a way of interpreting the cards. Numerology is pretty big with playing cards, so you can't go wrong with trying to understand what any given number means. And then elements, and I think elements are things that we can rationalize and understand a little bit more easily. The idea of water with emotions and understanding our heart, the the idea of diamonds with earth and how that might then relate to finances and more tangible matters in life, or clubs with passions and desires and how we then act upon those and may see them in a card where we now know that 5 is a very disruptive number, and we know that the clubs are a very active suit, and what does that look like when we go to interpret things. So I would say break it down into its simple parts and approach it that way, as opposed to looking at a card and feeling confused by this very abstract and arbitrary series of symbols. Try to understand it through the idea of numbers and life lessons and ideas, if possible. Now, 2 other decks that I use quite frequently. I would say I use these now in my practice a bit more. I love Ana Cortez's decks. I love the imagery, but I have been trying to push myself to be able to interpret without that amount of imagery with lesser illustrated cards. Now, one that is a bit lesser illustrated but still gives you something on each of the cards, and I find this one to be really fun, is the Hermes, or Robert M. Poise's The Hermes Playing Cards Oracle. Looks like this. You can get them on Robert M. Poise's website, and for Ana Cortez's, you can get them on her website, just searching her up, or I believe hers is available on Amazon as well, if I'm not mistaken. The backs look like this. Little Hermes right there. And on the fronts, some of them are all kind of topsy-turvy, but you get, for example, what would look like a very basic playing card, but you get one symbol in the middle. So for the 5 of hearts, we have the black cat. We have a star for the 6 of hearts, a little sapling tree for the 7. I think we have a lot of hearts there. 6 of spades, we get a tower. And these actually, you'll notice if you know Lenormand, the corresponding, there are fewer cards in Lenormand, but they are attributed to the larger playing card deck. So all of them will have an equivalent in a playing card deck. So when you see a card, for example, that, let's find one, would be from a Lenormand deck, or what you would find in a Lenormand deck, like the 9 of clubs with the fox. So you could technically pick out all of the ones that you might find in a Lenormand deck and use these cards in that way by selectively picking those ones out. But then there are also the court cards and all of the other cards that aren't featured in a Lenormand deck that still get images of their own. And you can interpret those or use the basic symbol to run with things a little bit more intuitively, but you aren't getting something so scenic and blatant to where you're being directed necessarily in a certain direction. But you might look at the pig with the 5 of diamonds. Okay, this is a very earthy suit. Pigs are involved with that idea of like mud and getting down and dirty. 5s are a bit more disruptive. So seeing how you might work with it in that way is very interesting, I find. I've gotten some very interesting readings out of these, and I have used these with clients a bit, and I've enjoyed how there's just this sort of very, very slight association with any of these symbols, because of course we see birds in our everyday life and we have sort of deeper meanings that we may attribute to them. So definitely recommend this one for segueing into lesser illustrated playing cards or more traditional style playing cards. Now, the more traditional style, I guess, playing card deck that I use the most, that I've mentioned a bunch of times, is Usi's Pagan Playing Cards. These are the backs. The court cards actually are really beautiful and interesting, as you can see here. But then when we get to just our ace through 10s, we get just very standard basic playing cards. They kind of have this old worn look to them. It reminds me of just being in like a different era or in a tea shop where cards are being laid down and there's something a little bit more mystical and whimsical about the act of using them. I think they're just really great quality. I love the differentiations in the court cards with those really standard playing card decks where all of the kings look exactly the same and all of the queens look exactly the same. That can be a little bit droll for me, at least. So I do like that there's more personality pictured within the courts, and then the aces get a little bit of a flair, which is more seasonal, and that's something that's fun to incorporate into playing cards as well. If you use tarot, you may use systems of correspondence, whether it's astrology or geomancy or numerology, the Kabbalah, things like that you can incorporate to bolster any sort of meaning or way that you might interpret the cards. With playing cards, of course, you can do the same. Like I mentioned, there's the numerological element, and there are multiple systems of numerology. Some are more standard, and then if I were to, for example, take the Kabbalah and foist it upon playing cards, I would start to interpret it a bit differently, just because in many systems of numerology, working toward 10 is like a cycle and things grow as we get toward the 10, versus Kabbalah, where things tend to get a little bit more chaotic and funky as you ascend or descend into the number 10. It's more like a degrading process. So those systems of numerology or number attributions are going to be different. So you can pick your own, and with playing cards, there isn't one hard and fast way. You will pick up a lot of these books and find that every author has something very different to say in the way that the cards should be interpreted. So there is a lot of freedom, and I would say to potentially invest in making a system of your own, deciding what attributions are important to you, what numerology you like to use, what elemental correspondences you want to use for each suit. Those are things that you can decide for yourself, and making those choices over time as you experience the cards is something I think that's worth investing in. And of course, having a notebook, which is something I recommend for learning tarot or learning almost anything, having a notebook to record your findings, your thoughts, your readings. Of course, you want to actively be engaging in reading and then recording those. But that's going to be a very helpful thing. I know for me, I pull one a day alongside the tarot card that I pull, and together the two kind of coalesce to create one message for me for the day. I found that when I didn't know playing cards very well, it was easier for me to take a playing card and try to connect it with a tarot card and then see what I thought about the two combining together. And it felt less intimidating. It felt like, for example, I wasn't just looking at this and not knowing what to do with it. I can take the idea of what I know an ace to be in tarot, and then I know that this, for example, is more of that earthy suit. So it's almost like it's the ace of coins or the ace of pentacles in some ways, and then I can then put a tarot card beside it and then decide, okay, when these two interact, what happens? So if you are familiar with oracle cards or tarot or systems like that, perhaps pulling a card a day alongside a system that you're already familiar with is going to make it a little bit easier and simple, and it's going to kind of slowly segue what these mean to you on any given circumstance. So I find that to be helpful. There's, of course, the idea that many say where the playing cards relate to the amount of weeks in a year or the lunar year a little bit more so than the solar year. That's a very interesting way to go about it. And of course, there's a more seasonal aspect if we are working with the lunar year. So you can use these if you are a magical practitioner who likes the wheel of the year and you want to start to understand the cards in terms of natural cycles and rhythms around you. That's one that works really well. I know, for example, most of these books will bring that up, but I do know that Cortez speaks heavily to the idea of the 52 cards relating to the wheel or the lunar wheel or the natural cycle of a year. So that's really interesting. And this deck actually showcases that a little bit too in a funny way. You start to see, for example, the seasons by the way that the garlands are decorated. And of course, different elemental correspondences, which can then relate to seasons, are going to vary from system to system, deck to deck. Oftentimes that ace of spades is where we would see that idea of death. So we have that present there. And then what's left? I think the ace of hearts, which gives us a really sweet flowering garland or wreath. So those were the decks and books that I would highly recommend, along with a few tips and tricks. I guess in recapping, I would say that those books are really solid starters. Maybe working with a deck that has more illustration if you do feel intimidated by the idea of lesser imagery, looking to create systems of your own, like number plus element equals something or has an outcome. That's a great way to approach it. And writing things down, practicing your readings, giving yourself that freedom. If you are familiar with different systems of card reading, using those to your advantage when learning the cards, and maybe using them as a bit of a stabilizer or a crutch until you start to develop your own relationship with that unique deck. I think that that's a great way to go about it. I hope that these tips and tricks were at least a little bit helpful, especially those book recommendations. I know it can be tough to sift through the many books out there and try to figure out which ones are best or which ones are really going to give you what you need. In my opinion, those three gave me the most bang for my buck, and I would recommend them to anybody looking to also learn the cards. I hope you are all doing well. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and let me know what you thought. Until next time, bye.